we really have a calling in our career. And I think that there's a lot of real good reasons for us to see that and explore that. But I also think it's pretty uncommon for us. And so hopefully today I can help you guys get a little bit of a perspective on this topic and what it can mean to you. Because I really believe that when we're exploring our calling, we're really expanding our career in all kinds of new ways. So here's what I'd like to start with. Let me get my screen working here. If we were having a conversation, I might come up to you and I might say, what do you do? We've all done this. We've been at some event and we'll walk around to somebody and we'll meet someone and we'll say, well, what do you do? And they'll immediately, of course, tell us about their career. And it's interesting because, we could have been asking about, what do they do with their family, or, what do they do with, their hobbies? Like, for instance, I have photography as a hobby, not as a career. We could be meaning that, but almost immediately everybody pretty much assumes that we mean career, and they'll start telling us about their job and their career. Now, I think if we ask a different question, if we ask this question, we said, tell me about your faith journey. Well, then sort of the default is to talk about, when you came to Christ, or, about your church, or maybe some ministry that you're involved in. Maybe something that God has shown you. But typically, most often about their church and their religious belief, it tends to start with, well, I was raised Catholic, or I go to such and such church, or, that's the kind of conversation we get if we ask about that. And what I find most interesting about these two questions next to each other is that it's pretty rare, unless the person you're talking to is a missionary or a pastor, that if you said, tell me about your faith journey, they're going to be talking about their career. And it's hard to get a sense today in this particular format if people are nodding their heads, but I think that that's probably pretty indicative of what we see. And I think that's a little tragic, because that basically means that our faith is sort of relegated to our church, and which is maybe one or a couple of days a week, and then for the other 5 or 6 days a week, we're almost acting like our faith isn't present with us, because we can't actually articulate how our faith journey intersects with our career, which is what we spend most of our time doing for most of us. That's kind of the genesis of this concept. Now, if you're seeing my screen and you see behind me, you might be able to notice that there's a camera up there. Don's already talked about my photography background, and I did at one point in time actually was a professional photographer, actually ran a business doing that. Plus I did that in my journalism time when I was younger. And so I've always had this journey of that. And one of my sons, when he was growing up, he wanted to be a musician, and we would have this conversation kind of based on my photography experience. It would say, he would say, well, I want to be a musician. And I would say to Jeremy, I'd say, hey, I have people who've always come to me in my photography career. And also when I actually ran the digital camera business for Dell for 5 years. And so people would come to me and say, oh, I love photography. And I would say to them, well, great. Well, what kind of camera do you have? And they would say, oh, well, no, I mean, I just like to take pictures. And so there's this division that happens in where someone is, and that's what this slide talks about. So what I found was that most people that said they love photography, what they meant was, I have sort of a romantic fascination with it, right? I like the concept of it, but I'm not really into it, right? I'm interested, but it's sort of a distant engagement. But someone who's really an amateur photographer, they start really playing in the role of becoming an expert. They sort of have that as their identity to some degree. They're much more committed. And they're asking this question, how will I improve and enjoy this hobby that I want? Now, if they decide to become a professional, that changes things again. Now I have, yes, I'm an expert at photography, but I have this business identity, right? It's caught up with my career now. And there's the engagement in that is funding, right? Like, I am funding my business. That's the question. How will I make money at this thing that I enjoy? And so one of the questions that I began to explore was, well, where is calling fit in this? And so here's what my take is on that. I think that, if I think about calling, um, there's this expertise that is there, but because I'm being called, to be called means from without yourself, right? So it also represents the idea that we have an anointing, right? It's not just that, I'm doing this because I want to be an expert, but because God is calling me to that and he's anointing me for that. But neither one of those things is my identity, right? My identity is in Christ, and the anointing and the expertise flow out of that. They aren't the thing in and of itself like they are when you're just considering it from a professional or a hobby perspective. There's also a transforming engagement. Like we want to think that, if God called somebody to go do something, it's about the thing that they're going to be called to do. If you've ever read the book of Jonah, he's called to go to the Ninevites, and though he's resistant at first, when he goes, literally in just a few words, it's like the greatest preaching ever. The entire city repents, and if we can only cause that to happen today, it would be amazing, right? And so he should be thrilled, but the rest of the book is really about what God's doing in him. So the transforming engagement is not just about who we're being sent to in our calling, but about us. What God is doing is always growing us in our calling. So we need to be looking at both of those dynamics. What is he calling me to do, and what is he calling me to grow into as I take this journey with him? And of course, there's always an eternal impact, whereas you aren't guaranteed that in the others. And so I think the question here isn't so much about how will I, but how will God transform me, impact others through me, and how will he receive glory for it? And so I think that that's sort of the elements that you get when you start to pursue something that's calling. Now, a couple of other points on this is, your calling isn't necessarily caught up with money like it is in the professional space. Paul was a tent maker. He he made his money out of, making tents, but then used that time in the marketplace to impact others. And so his bigger calling was bringing the gospel to the Gentiles, all of us, which is very fortunate because otherwise we would not be here. Uh, that was his real calling, but his way of funding his life was separate from that. So that's sometimes a way that we pursue calling. But it was also, he was clearly using that ability to make money to put him in the marketplace and put him in front of people as well. Um, the other thing is, so it's not necessarily caught up with money, but the reality is, if you're spending 5 or 6 days of your life doing it um, every week, then where is calling in that, right? More than likely, probably you have calling even if you haven't considered that. But if you really can't start to ascertain that and see that, then why are you doing that? Now, I think this is where a lot of Christians have a dilemma. We have a hard time seeing how what we do in our career can actually be a calling from God. Now, before we get into that, I'm going to talk some more about that specifically, but let's just like go back to the beginning. Um, when you when you think about this word in the beginning, my same son that I was talking about that wanted to be a musician, when he was a little older, we went to look for colleges, and one of the places we went to was John Brown, and they had a performing arts center there. And when you walked in, they had this sort of word cloud picture on the wall, and in the center of that word cloud was the words, "In the beginning, God created." And it really had this super profound immediate effect on me when I saw that, because obviously I've heard that before, but normally it's he created the heavens and earth. And because this word cloud sort of separated who he was as a creator from what he was doing in creation, it kind of made me go think about it differently. It made me think, wow, of course, yeah, he's a creator. But immediately kind of God showed me, like, it just hopped down later into the Genesis story where it says, then he said, let us make mankind in our own image. Um, and so that they can rule. And so it's this interesting thing where I went, well, hold it. If he is a creator, and he's created us in his image, then we are co-creators. We're creators. And there's many verses in the Bible that share this. And there's a point in that so that we can rule. He goes on to say, he blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth and subdue it. And this is what's sometimes called the cultural mandate, right? We are to fill the earth with God worshipers, and we're to manage the earth. We're to co-rule with him and to co-create with him. And that is, in essence, what all humans are called to. So right off the bat, you see that, whether you even accept him or not, he is always calling you. He has built this in. Now, sometimes people will tell me, well, okay, that's fine, but that was before the fall, right? And, and it's true, right? Later on, we have this fall that's actually made our job more difficult, but it didn't take it away. And you can see that because after Noah, um, has the ark and relands, God says the same exact terms all over again. So this is post fall. And yet again, we're being told the cultural mandate to be fruitful, increase in number, and fill the earth and subdue it. So we see that that calling continues for all of us. We all have this calling. So what are we called to? We're called to create, and we are called to be co-creators. And so whatever work we're doing, we're called to create. Now, here's an interesting thing. I don't have a slide on this, but unless you doubt that you're thinking, okay, yeah, but that's in the context of faith, go back and read Genesis 1 through 4 sometime, and you will see that not only did God create the earth, but all the story of man in chapter 4, you start to see cities being created, different work types being created, all kinds of everything else we have in civilization being created. And then at the very end of verse 4, it says, and then man began to call on the name of the Lord. And so what you see is that all of work was all sort of created and established in cities and civilization and government, different types of work, different types of career before you get to religion being created. In the sense that, man is starting to codify religion, if you would. So we're not in a bad place when we start to think and start to realize that the work of faith is not just for those that are in professional religion. But we tend to think that, but we're really called to create. So let's get a little orientation to where we are. When you think about looking at a map, what's the super important about that, and I learned this when I was in the military, the very first thing in map reading is to orient yourself to the map, to the ground. Like, where are we in relation to this map and to the ground and where we are? And you've seen this if you go to some hiking thing, it'll say, here's where you are. I like this little picture, you think you're here, you should be here, where are you? And so humans are born sort of in a natural state of disorientation to our world. The rest of creation, operates from instinct, but we're really given this godlike power to create our world. And whether we realize it or not, we are all actually doing exactly that. We are creating our world. Like, you can't actually not create culture, right? And that's really the very first state. Where are we in our calling journey? And so I want to kind of point out what I'm going to show you here in these next few slides is one is sort of a funnel on the left that talks about, fewer and fewer people that realize sort of where they are, in this funnel. But it correlates to sort of the various callings that God has given us. And so because we're all created as humans, we all live in culture, and we're all going to create culture whether we realize it or not. So you might create really garbage culture, or you might create really impactful good culture. You might sit around and watch Netflix, all the time and eat bonbons, and, that would be the entire culture. That would be the legacy that you would teach your kids, that this is what life is about. Or you can actually go and create really good culture, and you're going to show that to your kids. But whether you realize it or not, you are creating culture. And every single human being on the planet is. And that's the first thing God has called us to. We all have common grace. We all have the skills that we've been given, the passions we've been given, the same amount of time every day. So we can all, participate. Most of us are kind of doing it unintentionally. The more intentional we are about what we're doing in culture, the more we're really living out of that first calling, which is the call to create. So, I love this quote from Hamlet, this above all to thine own self be true, and it must follow as night to day that thou canst not be false to any man. And so we get caught up in this. How does one really know, who they are and what they should do? And it takes a little bit of faith to be able to get to that. I love this verse in Hebrews 11:1 for that very reason, right? Faith is the substance of things hoped for and not seen. And when we realize that we're operating out of faith, we have to kind of say, like, here's who I understand God has made me to be, and here's the vision He's given me in life. And it's not like it's there. If it was there, there would be no faith involved. And so when we're going and pursuing our calling, we're basically saying, okay, God, how have you wired me? And what are we going to do together? And okay, here's what I think that is. And we're operating out of faith. And even if we're not completely correct, He's going to give to us like manna every day, a little bit more of that journey. We tend to want all the lights to be green before we leave the house. And God's like, no, you're going to start. He told Abraham to leave and go to a place he would show him. He didn't show him exactly where that was. It wasn't all figured out in the beginning. And us understanding our calling is not either, but accepting that we have one is this first starting position. And so I hope that you guys can see that that's what faith is to work this out. So how can we add a few more words to that? Well, when we're called to create, He's wired each of us individually differently. You have the gifts that you have your skills, you have actually relationships that other people don't have. You have the communities that you have the passions that you have the same amount of time, but you can choose how you carve out that time and prioritize it. And we all have different kinds of resources we can bring to bear. So when you mix all of those together, you can begin to ask yourself, what does this tell me? What would I do with these? What kind of culture will I create? And also, will I live from a concept of lack or leverage? Sometimes people say, well, like for instance, I'm not 6 feet tall. And whether you know it or not, most CEOs are 6 feet taller. So I could be saying, well, I'll never be a CEO in my life because I'm not 6 feet tall. That's sort of living out of lack. Or you can say, well, okay, statistically that might be true, but what skills do I have? What can I actually bring to the table? How do I leverage those instead of live out of lack? And that's all faith. When you say, okay, God, you gave me these things, what are we going to do with them? That is operating out of faith on our way to our calling. I think we can say to ourselves, where do we desire to work, right? Am I going to work in the space of family? Is my calling in family? And by the way, a calling might be in multiple places. It is maybe in family, but also in media, or also in government, or also in business. And so when you look at these and you look at this particular iteration, you can see that in each one of these, you can do them in a way that is godless, or you can pursue them in your calling with God. Family, where either blessings or curse is passed to successive generation. What will we do? It all depends on how much we're really going down this path with God, and that is what calling is at the end of the day. Here's another book, and there's several different things like this, but this has been around a long time. What color is your parachute? And they have a whole exercise where this flower is, again, you're adding more words. What is my knowledge and interest? What are the people environments I want to work with? And as you consider these and say, what do I know to be true about myself? What is God telling me about my desires? Then it starts to form a picture about who you are that you can then try to find affinity with the places that you want to work in the world. It gives you a lot more clarity about what you are going to go do. So when you go to pursue work, you're not just looking for a job, you're looking for a place in the world where you can serve with the specific gifts you have in a specific and meaningful way that God has given you to do. And that's a completely different thing than looking for a job. And so hopefully you kind of get some of the ideas of that. Let's continue our journey here. The next ring, I think, is what I'm calling celestial. And this means that, I have some kind of sense that God's there. Right. So this is an interesting poll that says that about 90% of people in the US, believe at least in some kind of higher power. So even the group that says they don't believe in God, some percentage of them still believe that there's some kind of higher power. And so that's what the celestial group is, right? It means that they're open to the fact that there's a presence bigger than themselves in the world. And so, is that where you are on your journey, right? Now, I like this quote. We were talking before about being true. I love this quote by Ruth Childs Simon that says, being yourself is not as important as being his. And I think it's the perfect introduction to the next place on the mountain, which is when you actually become a Christian. And this is where God has called you to abundant life. Sometimes we say we're saved, but what Jesus said was, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. And so I like to say this is the call not to salvation, but the call to abundant life. This is where our life isn't just about, us anymore, but actually about the incarnational reality of his presence in our life. And it changes everything because it infuses everything. It's not like we become a different person when we go to work. This is the whole point. When we go to work, Christ is still our life and we still have abundant life. The question is whether or not we're going to pursue that and be intentional about it. I like this quote from Andy Crouch. Sometimes Christians kind of critique culture or they condemn it or they copy it. We've all seen sort of the hokey copy movie that's a Christian copy. And that's not actually the way to create culture, right? The only way to change culture is to create more of it. And so how is God calling you to actually be creative right in the middle of your workplace for his glory and for the impact and benefit of others? That's really a better way to think about it than how do I just sort of wrap this thing around, Christianity? What kind of creative culture is God giving you? So our next thing is like sometimes people are Christians, and I think we know this, and then there's other people that are very committed to their faith, and so that commitment, sometimes people call that obedience, but I think that's actually the call to devotion. God wants us to have a devoted relationship with Him, right? I like Chris's granddaughter calling he and his wife Lolly and Pop, and because it's such a love and devotion statement, right? He's devoted to her, not just operating out of obedience with her. And that's what our posture should really be to God. That's what Christ is really looking for. And so, what we want to be able to do is pursue that devotion. And I think that this is a place where it begins to really change too. And this quote from Elizabeth Barrett Browning really impacts me when I think about it this way. We tend to go and look at the world, and maybe we're judging, is this good or is this bad, or we're consuming it, right? But what Romans 12:1 says is in view of God's mercies, offer your body as a living sacrifice. So our calling is to offer our body as a living sacrifice, and it's easy to do when we're spending our time viewing what God's mercies are in every situation. We come to a situation and we say, well, this is good or bad based on how it's going to affect us, instead of saying, what are you doing in this moment, God? And in viewing the mercies that he has and then saying, great, how do I collaborate with that right now? When we look at it that way, we're taking off our shoes and not just plucking blackberries. And so that's what you get when you start to get to the devotion point, is like, I know God's here, And I know he is doing all things, working out all things for the good of those who love him. Um, and so my role is to say, what are you doing, God? And how do I collaborate with you? Because I'm devoted to that, because I'm devoted to you. So then the next space is when we begin to take that devotion and go, oh, this really means I'm called, and get very intentional about exactly what you're called to do in your space of service, in your space of leadership, all to this idea of this eternal perspective. Like we're going to be called to go home. But that's not, oh, well, one day I get to go home, right? We're here right now as ambassadors. And as an ambassador, we're representing this other country called God's country, but we have an active role. It's not passive. It's really to go out and represent that well in the middle of the issues and problems that God has put us in the domain of. So if you're in technology, how do you do this in a way that lifts up society and doesn't exploit it, right? If you're in media, how do you do it in a way that promotes truth and not just propaganda, right? So in every single career domain, we can act like we are the ambassadors that we are because we really are missionaries. And again, a lot of times Christians think that it's a higher calling to go give up what you're doing and go become a pastor or become a missionary. But the point is you're already a missionary right in the middle of your work. And what we need to do is be able to get intentional about that and ask God, how do we go do that? So how do you go do that? How do you go ask him? Now, I love that the Apostle Paul, in the beginning of Galatians, he has this great line where he says, God at some point at his timing revealed his son in me. It speaks to the fact that it has to be revealed, which means we have to ask, right? So God is calling you, and you have to go and say, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, and say, okay, what does that mean specifically for me? And so the first start, if it's gonna be revealed, is that you have to go ask, seek, access the Spirit of God. The next thing is to really reckon it to be true. Like if you don't believe what I'm saying right now, if you don't recognize that it's true, then you don't care, right? But when you become awake and you reckon it to be true, you can, be more active and intentional about it. You can begin to explore it and look into it. You can begin to add more words and characterize them. So, to have the faith and trust to access the Word of God, and to go down that path. And then you can renew your mind. This is the back part of what Romans 12:1 that I mentioned before says. Romans 12:2 says, do not be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to know what God's will is. Well, we want to take that verse sometimes and think that that means, don't go do unmoralistic things. But the pattern of this world is really operating on your own, independent of God. And not conforming to that is to say, no, I'm collaborating with God. So God, renew my mind. Help me see that reality in every single thing I'm doing every single day. And then finally, to remain, right? This is what Jesus said, that, we had to abide, we had to remain in the vine, right? We have to let his life flow out of us. And this is really practicing the presence of God. So when you bring these four things together, not in your church life, but in your day-to-day life with your family, in your day-to-day life in your work, that is actually exercising calling. You actually have the calling. If you're a Christian, Christ is already your life. It's really just about you recognizing it, getting your mind around it, and being more intentional about it. So here's a couple of other thoughts to sort of get this going for you, right? How do you think about that in terms of all the world? And there's this organization that's called His Way at Work. And they have this grid that looks like this one where, imagine that you're a business leader and you're thinking about your business. And so you have employees and you have family, you have the community you're serving, the broader community you're in, both local, national, global. And there's physical needs, there's emotional needs, and there's spiritual needs. And the idea of this matrix is to slowly over the course of time radiate out from the top left, you know, throughout the rest of the grid. Because, you know, if you say, well, hey, the the employees I have don't have enough money for their families to survive, but I'm going to ask them if they want to go on a mission trip to Guatemala. Well, that's silly, right? I need to do first things first. And so what I love about this grid is it kind of gives you a roadmap to build out from. And now, obviously, this is kind of as a business leader, but it's the same thing for you if you're working someplace. How do I love God? How do I do that with my family? How do I do that in my workplace? How do I do that in bigger places than that in the world? You have to work that out over time. And so here's a couple of ideas for you guys to think about as you review this today. You know, how do you see Christ working through you in your life, right? Beginning to notice it, even if you don't have a full theology of it, is the start, right? To notice where he shows up, to notice it more and more, and have that infuse your life. You know, what are some ways you could begin to explore it? And what is one way that you could regularly share and represent the hospitality of your true home to those that God has given you? And then here this last week, I've been asking people this question. You know, if you think of, we've heard the phrase that we're the average or the sum of the five people closest to us. If you think about where you feel like you're leading to go in the next 1 to 3 to 5 years, you know, do you have the right five people that are helping you get there? Who do you need? What is lacking? And how would you actually ask God to start to give you those relationships? And those don't have to just be in career. They could be like, you know, how do I go further with God? Right? Who could actually help me do that? You know, how do I get a deeper relationship with my spouse? Who could help me do that? And so that's another way to be intentional, is to say, who do I need to center around me that can help me go and pursue the calling that God has for me? So I hope that this gives you guys a little bit of a sense of how you really are called, and gives you some ideas to kind of figure out where are you in your journey, and inspires you to take your next step. Thank you all so much.